In Imperial by Design, as Mearsheimer is an offensive realist, he is focused on the politics of powers. He presents a reflection on how we guide the decision-making of powers like the US within transformations like those of the post-Cold War. What does the post-Cold War period present from the perspective of realism for a country like the US? It presents a scenario of unipolarity that was not seen in the Cold War. For the realist who has in mind the cyclical dimension of power, unipolarity is a complicated condition, since for the realist, unipolarity is something that tends not to remain over time. Unipolarity is vulnerable. If a realist looks at a unipolar scenario, what will he think about what will happen next? There will be a cycle where your power will diminish. So for the US, what should they think about the international system? They must think about how to avoid this weakening. If you are in a condition of unipolarity, your entire strategy, in the view of someone like Mearsheimer, should be aimed at avoiding being weakened and to maintain for as long as possible the greatest stability possible, so that you can enjoy this condition for longer. If you are someone concerned with developing the proper strategy in the American position, you must consider that unipolarity is vulnerable and that the tendency is for wear and tear and confrontation. If you build your hegemony too aggressively, you will wear out faster. So what are the choices that allow the US, in that post-Cold War context, to reduce the strain on its relationship with other countries and build its hegemony in the most intelligent way possible and maximize the extent of its predominance in that scenario? Let's look at history. Let's see the implemented strategies and what worked and what didn't. In the early 20th century, Americans opted for an isolationist strategy. Two things are important to say about this strategy. It served the Americans extremely well in order to save their power, and it is a product of its very privileged geographical condition. Not just anyone can opt for this strategy of isolationism in the same way as the Americans. So looking at the American position, you can see that the country is so isolated that we don't have neighbors on the sides. It has two seas on the sides. It has a defeated enemy below, which is Mexico, which poses no threat, and there's a giant chunk of ice at the top, which is Canada, which, while it looks very big, is not big enough in terms of offering a geopolitical challenge to Americans. So Americans have incredibly peaceful borders. This is what allows them to opt for a strategy of isolationism. But even from a technological point of view, isolationism gradually becomes infeasible with the projection of air power and the intercontinental anti-ballistic missiles, for example. Thus, Americans can no longer consider themselves as invulnerable because of that isolated condition. Although it was a very efficient strategy, it is no longer technologically viable. The second strategy is offshore balancing. When doing offshore balancing, the first thing to do is determine the strategic points where you need to intervene. Why? Because you need to save energy and can't act everywhere at the same time. That's when you determine which are the strategic regions of the globe for maintaining your power. So why do this? If you don't determine which are the strategic regions, you will need to be willing to act everywhere, and that would bring rapid wear and tear. The decline in your power will accelerate. You need to determine the core regions for the continuity of your power project. For Americans, there are only three determining areas in which the transformations can be consequential to the continuity of their projection of their predominance in the long term. For Mearsheimer, for the US, after the 90s, there are three important regions: Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Everything else is irrelevant. It must be systematically ignored. How do you behave in these countries? You need to guarantee the local balance of power. You don't put troops there. You don't try to control the internal politics of countries. You don't make choices unless you are forced to act. You protect the balance of power. If there is a chance of disruption of the balance of power, only then can you mobilize your troops to operate surgically in that moment of crisis to re-establish the balance of local power. After that, you return your troops home. Offshore balancing presents the idea that you can control beyond the coast. You don't put troops on the ground. You monitor from a distance because you know your biggest challenge is to avoid something that can disrupt the balance of power. To have a possible disruption, it will be necessary to have a regional hegemon. If you can control the regional hegemon before it becomes hegemonic on a bigger scale, you won't have someone to challenge you. So we have the idea of putting a region as a priority area and monitoring the balance of power from a distance. This is more economical than ostensibly monitoring. Selective engagement is based on the same principle as offshore balancing. The first thing we need to do to have an ongoing power projection strategy is to recognize the strategic areas, Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. But instead of just monitoring balance from a distance, you use troops on the ground. Troops on the ground allow intervention more effectively. It is more costly from an economic point of view to maintain the troops and also from the point of view of the wear and tear of having foreign troops deployed in another country's territory. From the point of view of rationality, you know that it is more costly, but it is worth it because of its effectiveness. The idea is that troops on the ground allow you to be more effective when a certain situation occurs. This is selective engagement. The fourth strategy is the global domination strategy. That's when you act on all continents. There is no pre-established strategic priority. You project yourself as a kind of police in the world. You position yourself in universalist terms. For example, we have the war on terror narrative. The war on terror is global domination because it can take place anywhere. So when we put ourselves in the position of fighting the war on terror, you are willing to fight any enemy because it doesn't delineate the enemy's nature and doesn't determine the geography in which you intervene. The author makes two arguments about this. It's a weak idea to preserve its hegemony because it has a high level of attrition. It doesn't have a clear strategy and actions. Instead of preventing the decline, you accelerate the decline. You create unnecessary enemies. You inflate threats that didn't exist for you before. And there will be more confrontations than if the actions were only in its specific places. From the point of view of concerns that realism would need to have, in a scenario of unipolarity, nothing makes less sense than global domination. Many American presidents, Democrats and Republicans, from the 90s onwards, in the author's view, systematically opted for global domination. For the author, this is the anatomy of failure. If they were aware of the cyclical nature of power and the kind of vulnerability it is subject to as a unipolar power, they should be concerned with preserving that power. So for him, thinking of realism in the context of the 90s, you have to understand its unipolarity and its fragility. We must keep in mind the possibilities of wear of this unipolarity. We must avoid, minimize, or mitigate this wear. This should be the center of your strategy. So what is the strategy? The author argued 4 different types of strategies used by Americans. Isolationism was something that allowed Americans to preserve themselves for a long time. Offshore balancing is a much more economical strategy than the others. It chooses to act in specific scenario, but it takes time to intervene, which can be crucial in a given situation. In selective engagement, it exchanges the economics of the offshore balance for the agility of the engagement on the ground. So you operate strategically, deploy troops, pay the price of attrition, but intervene faster. And global domination is when you think you can be the world's police. Thank you for watching.